I once heard someone say that the loneliest place in the world isn't an empty house. It's a marriage where two people live together but never truly belong to each other. And for 3 years, Daniel Whitmore and Olivia Whitmore had perfected that exact kind of loneliness. From the outside, their life looked like something out of a magazine cover. The Whitmore estate stood on 12 quiet acres just outside Manhattan, a glass and stone mansion glowing softly under warm exterior lights, the kind of place where black SUVs rolled through iron gates and reporters sometimes waited outside, hoping to photograph the city's most mysterious power couple. Inside, the marble floors reflected golden light from tall chandeliers. The grand staircase curved like something built for royalty, and framed photographs of charity galas, foundation dinners, and red carpet events lined the hallway walls, every image showing the same thing. Daniel Whitmore, the billionaire CEO whose real estate empire had reshaped half of Manhattan's skyline, standing beside his elegant wife Olivia, both of them smiling with practiced perfection while cameras flashed. The world loved their story. Magazines called them the quiet royalty of New York business society, a billionaire who avoided scandal, and a graceful young artist who somehow captured his heart. The headlines were predictable. Whitmore marriage still going strong. New York's most private billionaire couple. And sometimes, when the gossip columns ran out of ideas, simply, the perfect marriage nobody understands. But the truth behind those walls was far quieter and far stranger than anyone outside could imagine. Because every night when the lights dimmed and the city skyline glowed through the enormous glass windows, Daniel Whitmore walked down the long upstairs hallway, past the bedroom door with Olivia's name engraved on a small silver plate, and continued another 20 feet to his own room. 2 bedrooms, 2 separate lives, separated by a silent agreement that had never been broken. For 3 years they had lived under the same roof without crossing that invisible line, without reaching for each other, without even pretending that their marriage meant anything beyond the simple words written on a contract locked in Daniel's office safe. The contract had been signed on a rainy afternoon 3 years earlier in a quiet conference room overlooking Central Park. 8 pages long, precise language, simple rules, marriage. For public stability, shared appearances when necessary, respect and privacy guaranteed, and one clause written clearly in the center of page 4. No emotional obligation and no physical relationship required. Olivia had read the line twice before signing. Daniel had watched quietly, offering no explanation and no apology. And when the pen touched paper, the deal had been sealed with the calm efficiency of a business transaction rather than the excitement of a wedding promise. Yet somehow that strange arrangement had worked. At least on the surface. Daniel built skyscrapers and negotiated billion-dollar deals while Olivia filled quiet afternoons in a sunlit studio on the second floor, painting city skylines and abstract oceans. Their lives moved in careful parallel lines that rarely touched. Polite conversations over breakfast, occasional charity events where they stood side by side for photographs, and then the same quiet routine returning each night when the doors of 2 separate bedrooms closed. In public, Daniel Whitmore was known as a man who controlled everything, a strategist who never made emotional decisions, a billionaire whose calm voice could settle boardroom arguments in seconds. But lately something inside him had begun to shift in ways he couldn't explain. Maybe it started the night he came home earlier than expected and found Olivia sitting on the wide stone steps outside the house, barefoot despite the cool autumn air, holding a small sketchbook in her lap while she watched the sunset fade behind the trees. She hadn't noticed him at first, and for several quiet minutes Daniel had simply stood there, watching the woman the world called his wife, laughing softly to herself as she sketched the fading light across the sky. There had been something peaceful about the moment, something unguarded and genuine that felt completely different from the carefully composed woman who stood beside him at formal events. Later that night Daniel had walked back to his room like he always did, but the hallway suddenly felt longer than usual, the silence heavier, and the strange realization that after 3 years of marriage he still didn't truly know the woman living 20 feet away had lingered in his thoughts longer than he expected. Outside, the city of New York never slept. Traffic hummed along distant highways, and the glow of Manhattan's skyline painted the horizon in silver light. But inside the Whitmore mansion something subtle was beginning to change. something quiet and dangerous for a man who had built his entire life on control. Because for the first time since the contract had been signed, Daniel Whitmore was starting to wonder what might happen if the rules they had followed for 3 years suddenly stopped existing. The following morning arrived quietly over the Whitmore estate, the pale gold light of early autumn sliding across the tall glass walls of the mansion and stretching slowly across the polished marble floors. And just after 6:30, Daniel Whitmore was already awake, sitting at the long walnut dining table with a cup of black coffee cooling beside his untouched breakfast, while a tablet displayed the opening numbers of the New York financial markets. For most people, the early hour would have felt peaceful, but for Daniel the silence felt unusually heavy, as though something small yet persistent had followed him from the night before and settled somewhere in the back of his thoughts. He had built his life on discipline and routine. Mornings began with financial reports, followed by calls with executives in Chicago and Los Angeles before he even left the house. But today his focus kept drifting toward the hallway upstairs and the quiet room where Olivia was probably still asleep. The strange thing was that for 3 years he had rarely thought about what happened on the other side of that door. Their lives had operated smoothly with careful boundaries, and he had always assumed that arrangement suited both of them perfectly. The faint sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts, and a moment later Olivia appeared at the far end of the dining room, wearing a soft gray sweater and loose linen pants, her hair still slightly tousled from sleep, and a sketchbook tucked under one arm as though it were the most natural accessory in the world. She paused when she noticed Daniel already seated at the table, and for a brief moment the quiet room seemed to hold its breath the way it often did during their morning encounters. Their conversations were usually short and polite, like two neighbors sharing a hallway rather than a married couple sharing a home, and yet today something felt subtly different. Olivia walked toward the kitchen counter and poured herself a cup of coffee before glancing toward him with a small but genuine smile that carried none of the polished perfection she used at charity events. She said, "Good morning, Daniel," in a calm voice, and he answered the same way he always did. But this time his attention lingered longer than usual as he noticed the faint traces of charcoal on her fingertips from late-night drawing. The sketchbook in her hand rested on the table when she sat down across from him, and although she did not say anything about it, Daniel found himself curious despite himself. Olivia noticed his glance and turned the book slightly, so the page faced away from him with a quiet laugh that sounded almost apologetic as she said it was nothing finished yet, just a study of the Hudson River at sunset. Daniel nodded and returned his eyes to the tablet screen in front of him, but the numbers had lost their sharp clarity, and for the first time in a long time the calm efficiency of his morning routine felt strangely hollow. Olivia finished her coffee quickly because she had a habit of disappearing into her studio for hours once inspiration struck, and as she stood she paused for a second as though deciding whether to say something more. Finally, she spoke in that same relaxed tone and mentioned that she would be in Brooklyn later that afternoon delivering a few paintings to a small gallery that had offered to display her work for a weekend show. Daniel looked up again, surprised not by the news itself but by the quiet excitement in her voice. Because Olivia rarely talked about her work with him even though her studio filled half the second floor, he responded politely and wished her good luck, and she thanked him before walking toward the back hallway where sunlight spilled through the open glass doors leading to the garden. When she stepped outside, the air carried the cool scent of fallen leaves and distant traffic from the highway, and Daniel watched through the window as she settled onto the stone steps with her sketchbook just like she had the night before. The sight stirred that same unfamiliar feeling in his chest, a realization that the woman living in his house had an entire world of thoughts and ambitions he had never truly explored. Across the table, the untouched breakfast had grown cold and the tablet screen dimmed automatically. But Daniel did not notice either of those things because he was watching Olivia tilt her head slightly while studying the morning light across the trees as though the moment itself were something worth preserving. Somewhere in the back of his mind, another thought quietly surfaced, one that felt surprisingly unsettling for a man who prided himself on absolute clarity. After 3 years of carefully following every rule of their arrangement, Daniel Whitmore was beginning to wonder if the rules had quietly changed without him realizing it. 3 years earlier, the rain had been falling steadily over Manhattan, The kind of cold April rain that turned sidewalks slick and painted the city lights across the streets like blurred reflections. And inside a quiet conference room on the 42nd floor of Whitmore, Holdings, a young woman named Olivia Parker, had stood near the tall window staring out at Central Park while the storm rolled slowly across the skyline. The room smelled faintly of leather and fresh coffee, and the long glass table in the center held a single folder that looked far too formal for the strange meeting that had brought her there. Olivia had arrived exactly on time that afternoon, carrying a worn canvas bag filled with sketches and a portfolio of unfinished paintings because she had believed she was meeting a potential investor interested in supporting small independent artists. But the moment she stepped into the room, she realized the situation was very different. Daniel Whitmore had been standing near the table when she entered, tall and composed in a dark charcoal suit, the kind of man who carried quiet authority without raising his voice. And even before he spoke, Olivia recognized the name because his company had recently completed one of the tallest towers along the Hudson River. Daniel had greeted her politely and offered a seat, but he did not begin with small talk or explanations. Instead, he placed the folder in front of her and said something that sounded more like a business proposal than a personal conversation. He told her that the meeting would be unusual and that she deserved complete honesty before deciding anything. And then he explained that his family board had been pressuring him to stabilize his public image after several aggressive takeover attempts by rival investors who believed his personal life made him appear too independent and unpredictable. Olivia listened carefully, still unsure why she had been called there at all. And then Daniel said the sentence that had changed everything that followed. He said he was offering her a marriage. For a moment, Olivia had been certain she misunderstood, and the quiet rain tapping against the window made the silence feel almost surreal. Daniel remained calm and continued speaking with the same measured tone he used during corporate negotiations, explaining that the marriage would be entirely strategic, a public partnership that would protect his company from board interference while also giving Olivia the financial freedom to continue her work as an artist without worrying about rent or unstable gallery contracts. The proposal sounded unreal even as he described it, and Olivia had stared at him across the table, wondering whether she had accidentally stepped into a conversation meant for someone else. Daniel slid the folder closer to her and explained that everything was written clearly inside, including the terms that guaranteed privacy, financial independence, and the right for either of them to end the arrangement after a minimum period of 3 years. Olivia opened the folder slowly and saw the contract printed in precise legal language. 8 pages that outlined exactly what Daniel had described: shared residence for public appearances, separate personal lives respected at all times, and a clause stating that the marriage would carry no emotional expectations and no physical obligations. The honesty of that final line had surprised her more than the proposal itself, because Daniel spoke about the arrangement with almost uncomfortable transparency. He said he did not believe in pretending affection that did not exist, and that if she accepted the agreement, they would treat each other with respect, but never with false promises. Olivia had leaned back in the chair, absorbing the weight of the moment, while rain continued sliding down the glass behind Daniel like thin silver lines. She had spent the past 2 years moving between tiny studio apartments in Brooklyn while trying to sell paintings through small local galleries, sometimes earning enough to pay rent and sometimes not. And the idea of financial security sounded like something from another life. But the proposal also felt strangely impersonal, like signing a lease rather than entering a marriage. Daniel noticed her hesitation and added something unexpected that afternoon, something that later echoed in Olivia's memory many times. He told her she had the full right to refuse without explanation, and that if she walked out of the room he would never contact her again. He said the only reason he had chosen to approach her specifically was because during a charity event months earlier he had watched her speak honestly about art education for underfunded schools, and he believed she valued independence more than appearances. The comment caught Olivia off guard because she had assumed someone like Daniel Whitmore would never notice a small presentation in a crowded fundraising room. For a long moment neither of them spoke, while the rain softened outside and the late afternoon light dimmed across the city skyline. Finally, Olivia closed the folder slowly and looked directly at the man sitting across from her, still unsure whether she was about to make the most practical decision of her life or the most unusual one. And in that quiet moment, she asked Daniel a single question that would quietly shape everything that followed. If this marriage is only a contract, what happens when the 3 years end? Daniel Whitmore did not answer Olivia's question immediately that rainy afternoon 3 years earlier. And for a man known across New York business circles for decisive clarity, the silence felt unusually long. Outside the window, the storm had softened into a quiet drizzle that blurred the lights of Fifth Avenue, while traffic moved slowly through the wet streets nearly 40 stories below them. Daniel finally rested both hands on the edge of the glass table and looked directly at Olivia with the calm seriousness that had built one of the most powerful real estate companies in the country. He said that when the 3 years ended, the contract would end as well. No obligations, no penalties, and no expectation that either of them would remain connected if they chose not to. He explained that the agreement was designed to be clean and fair because neither of them should feel trapped in something they did not truly want. Olivia listened carefully, studying the man across from her, and something about the honesty in his voice made the strange proposal feel less like manipulation and more like an unusual form of respect. Daniel continued by explaining that during those 3 years, she would receive full financial independence through a trust created in her name, access to the Whitmore estate, and complete freedom to continue her work without interference from his company or his family board. The only responsibility she would carry would be appearing beside him at several public events each year and maintaining the appearance of a stable partnership that satisfied investors who believed a billionaire executive should live a traditional life. Olivia leaned forward slowly and closed the contract folder while absorbing the reality of the offer, because although it sounded surreal, it also represented something she had not experienced in years: stability. She had spent most of her 20s moving between small apartments in Brooklyn while chasing gallery opportunities that rarely lasted longer than a few months. And even though she loved painting more than anything, the constant uncertainty had quietly worn her down. Daniel watched her carefully and added something that surprised her even more than the proposal itself. He said that if she agreed, he would never interfere with her career and that the art studio on the second floor of the Whitmore estate would belong entirely to her. He said the space had been empty for years, and perhaps it was finally meant for someone who would actually use it. The idea of a permanent studio filled Olivia with a quiet excitement she had not felt in a long time, but she still understood the unusual nature of what Daniel was asking. She asked him one more question that afternoon, a question that came from a place deeper than finances or comfort. She asked why he had chosen her specifically when there were surely many women who would agree to such an arrangement without hesitation. Daniel did not answer immediately because the truth behind that question was more personal than anything else in the room. He walked toward the tall window and looked out at the gray skyline before explaining that months earlier he had attended a charity event hosted by a small arts education program in Brooklyn where Olivia had spoken passionately about how creativity could give children confidence even in neighborhoods where opportunity was limited. Daniel admitted that most speeches at those events sounded rehearsed and polite, but Olivia had spoken with genuine conviction and had refused a large corporate donation that came with conditions that would limit the program's independence. He said that moment told him something important about her character, that she valued freedom more than money and that she would not pretend to be someone she was not. Olivia had listened quietly while the rain faded into a soft mist across the city, and for the first time that afternoon she saw something human behind Daniel's carefully controlled exterior. Not a billionaire making a calculated deal, but a man who simply did not trust traditional relationships. The silence returned for several seconds before she finally spoke again and said something that would echo through the next 3 years of their lives. She said that if the marriage truly remained a contract, then honesty would have to be their only rule, because pretending to feel something that did not exist would make the entire arrangement impossible. Daniel nodded in agreement and reached for the pen resting beside the folder while sliding the contract back toward her. Olivia held the pen for a moment while thinking about the strange path that had brought her to that conference room on a rainy afternoon in Manhattan. She understood that signing the document would change her life in ways she could not fully predict, but she also understood that sometimes the most unusual choices created the most unexpected possibilities. The rain outside finally stopped completely as she signed her name on the final page. And when Daniel Whitmore added his signature beside hers, neither of them realized that the quiet agreement they had just created would eventually test every rule they had promised to follow. The courthouse ceremony took less than 15 minutes. Yet the moment quietly reshaped two lives that until then had never shared the same path. It happened on a mild June afternoon 3 years earlier, when the rain of that April meeting had long disappeared and the city had settled into the bright warmth of early summer. Olivia Parker arrived wearing a simple ivory dress she had borrowed from a friend, nothing extravagant, just something elegant enough to look appropriate in photographs. While Daniel Whitmore stood near the tall courthouse windows in a tailored navy suit that carried the calm confidence of a man accustomed to boardrooms rather than wedding vows. There were no family members present and no crowd waiting outside. Only Daniel's attorney, a notary public, and Daniel's assistant Claire, who held a small envelope containing the wedding rings. The entire scene felt more like the final step in a carefully negotiated agreement than a romantic milestone, and yet Olivia noticed a strange calm settling over her as the official read the formal words required by law. Daniel's voice remained steady when he repeated the vows, and Olivia responded in the same quiet tone. And for a brief moment, the ordinary sounds of the courthouse hallway outside drifted into the room. Footsteps echoing on tile floors, distant voices, and the hum of the city continuing without noticing that something unusual had just taken place. When the official pronounced them married, Daniel reached for the ring Claire handed him and gently placed it on Olivia's finger, a thin band of white gold with a small diamond that reflected the afternoon sunlight streaming through the glass. And Olivia returned the gesture with the matching ring Daniel had chosen earlier that week. Neither of them pretended the exchange carried deeper emotion than what it represented, a symbol that would satisfy the public expectations surrounding one of the most recognizable executives in New York. Claire quietly handed Daniel a leather folder containing the signed marriage certificate, while the attorney confirmed that the contract agreement remained active as planned. And within minutes the ceremony ended as simply as it had begun. Outside the courthouse the summer air felt warm and bright. Taxis rolled past in slow lines, and pedestrians hurried along the sidewalk, unaware that the man walking beside Olivia had just secured one of the most unusual marriages the city would never fully understand. Daniel paused beside the black car waiting at the curb and opened the door for her with the same polite respect he had shown since the beginning of their arrangement. During the short drive toward the Whitmore estate, the city skyline moved past the windows in quiet reflection, and neither of them spoke much because there was little left to say that had not already been decided weeks earlier. Olivia watched the tall buildings fade into tree-lined roads as the car left Manhattan behind, and she wondered briefly how life inside the Whitmore estate would feel compared to the small Brooklyn apartments she had called home for years. Daniel seemed comfortable with the silence because for him the marriage had already achieved its purpose, stability for the company board, and a calm solution to pressures that had threatened his control of Whitmore Holdings. When the car finally passed through the iron gates of the estate, Olivia felt the same quiet sense of disbelief she had experienced during that first meeting, because the property stretched across 12 peaceful acres surrounded by tall maple trees and carefully maintained gardens that softened the edges of the large stone mansion resting at the center. The house itself looked less like a residence and more like a quiet museum of glass and warm light, with tall windows overlooking lawns that rolled gently toward a distant line of trees. Daniel guided her inside through the front entrance, where the polished marble floors reflected the golden afternoon sunlight, and he explained calmly that the staff had already been informed of the arrangement and would respect her privacy at all times. He led her up the wide staircase toward the second floor and stopped halfway down a long hallway where two doors faced opposite directions. Daniel opened the door to the room on the left and said this would be her bedroom, a spacious suite with tall windows, soft gray walls, and a balcony overlooking the gardens. Then he walked several steps farther and indicated the door at the other end of the hall where his own room was located, explaining that the separation allowed them to maintain the boundaries written in the contract. Olivia nodded in understanding because they had both agreed that honesty would be easier than pretending affection that did not yet exist. Daniel then opened a third door halfway between the two bedrooms and revealed a large studio space filled with natural light from skylights above. Empty canvases leaning against the walls and a long wooden table waiting for paints and brushes, Olivia stepped inside slowly, realizing that the promise he had made during their meeting about a dedicated studio had not been exaggerated. The quiet room felt like an invitation to begin something entirely new, and for a brief moment, she forgot about the unusual circumstances that had brought her there. Behind her, Daniel watched with the calm expression he always carried, but somewhere in the back of his mind, he wondered whether the carefully balanced arrangement they had just created would remain as simple as it appeared on that warm summer afternoon. Life inside the Whitmore estate slowly settled into a quiet rhythm during the months that followed, a rhythm built not on romance, but on careful respect and clear boundaries that both Daniel and Olivia understood from the very beginning. The mansion was large enough that two people could live under the same roof without constantly crossing paths, and in many ways that space made their unusual arrangement easier than either of them expected. Each morning Daniel left early for his office in Manhattan, usually before 7:30, his black sedan disappearing down the long tree-lined driveway, while the early sunlight stretched across the gardens and reflected off the tall windows of the house. Olivia often woke after he had already gone, stepping quietly into the kitchen where the staff prepared coffee and breakfast with the calm efficiency expected in a home that frequently hosted business guests and charity events. At first she felt slightly out of place inside such an organized environment, but the staff quickly treated her with the same respectful professionalism they offered Daniel, never asking personal questions and never intruding on the privacy that had been promised in the contract. Most of Olivia's days unfolded inside the studio Daniel had shown her during that first afternoon, the large room filled with soft natural light pouring through the skylights above and long stretches of peaceful silence broken only by the sound of brushes touching canvas or the distant rustle of wind through the trees outside. She spent hours painting scenes inspired by the river, the city skyline, and sometimes the quiet gardens surrounding the estate, slowly building a collection of work that felt more confident than anything she had created before. The stability of having a permanent space and no immediate financial pressure allowed her creativity to grow in ways she had never experienced during her years of moving between small apartments in Brooklyn. Daniel noticed these changes even though they rarely spoke about her work directly, because every evening when he returned from the city, he often passed the studio door and saw new canvases resting against the walls, colors drying beneath the warm light of the room. Their conversations remained simple and polite, shared breakfasts on weekends, occasional dinners when both happened to return home early, and brief discussions about upcoming public events they needed to attend together. During those events they played their roles convincingly, standing side by side at charity galas, art fundraisers, and corporate dinners where cameras flashed and reporters quietly admired the calm elegance of the Whitmore couple. Olivia learned quickly how to navigate those evenings, wearing simple but graceful dresses and speaking thoughtfully with guests who assumed she had always belonged to that world. Daniel observed her during those gatherings with quiet approval, because she never behaved like someone seeking attention or status. Instead, she listened carefully to people and often asked thoughtful questions about their work or charitable projects. Claire, Daniel's assistant, once mentioned privately that Olivia had become unexpectedly popular among several nonprofit organizations who appreciated her sincerity. Despite these successful appearances, the boundaries inside the house remained unchanged. Daniel slept in his room at the end of the hallway and Olivia slept in hers, the two doors closing each night with the quiet understanding that their marriage existed within the rules they had both accepted. Yet over time small moments began to appear that neither of them had predicted. Sometimes Daniel returned home later than usual and found Olivia still awake in the studio, paint on her fingertips, while music played softly from an old speaker near the window. Occasionally she would show him a finished canvas and ask his opinion, and although Daniel claimed he knew very little about art, he always studied the work carefully before answering. One evening, she painted the view of the Hudson River at sunset, and Daniel stood quietly beside the canvas longer than expected before saying that the colors looked exactly like the sky he remembered from childhood summers. Moments like that were brief and often followed by comfortable silence. Yet they carried a subtle warmth that slowly softened the rigid structure of their arrangement. Olivia noticed that Daniel was not as distant as people often described him in business magazines. He remained calm and reserved, but he listened attentively whenever she spoke about her projects or the small gallery in Brooklyn that had started showing her paintings. In return, Olivia began to understand the immense pressure Daniel carried as the head of a company responsible for thousands of employees and billions of dollars in property developments. The respect between them grew naturally without either of them acknowledging it directly. And although the contracts still defined their marriage on paper, somewhere within the quiet halls of the Whitmore estate, the simple routine of two separate lives had begun to shift in ways that neither Daniel nor Olivia fully recognized yet. The quiet balance inside the Whitmore estate continued for many months, and although neither Daniel nor Olivia ever spoke about it openly, the atmosphere between them slowly changed in subtle ways that were easy to overlook but impossible to completely ignore. It began during the second year of their unusual marriage, when one particular evening placed them together in a situation that revealed more about each other than either of them expected. The event was a large charity gala held at the Metropolitan Arts Center in Manhattan, a formal gathering organized by several foundations supporting arts education programs across the city. Daniel had agreed to attend weeks earlier because Whitmore Holdings was one of the primary sponsors, and Olivia had been invited to accompany him not only as his wife, but also as an artist whose recent work had quietly gained attention among a few respected gallery curators. The night of the gala arrived with the warm glow of late autumn, the city streets filled with golden lights reflecting off the tall buildings as black cars lined the entrance of the museum. Inside the grand hall, the atmosphere carried the gentle hum of conversation, the sound of glasses clinking softly, and the polished elegance expected from one of the most prestigious charity events in New York. Olivia wore a deep blue evening dress that moved gracefully as she walked beside Daniel through the crowded room. And for a moment, several photographers captured their arrival, just as they always did at public appearances. Yet what happened later that evening created a moment that neither of them had predicted. During the reception, one of the event organizers approached Olivia with visible excitement and asked if she would briefly speak about her work because several young art students had been invited to attend the gala as part of the program. Olivia hesitated at first because she had not prepared any speech, but the sincerity in the organizer's request reminded her of the same passion that had once led her to speak at that small Brooklyn charity event where Daniel had first noticed her. Daniel stood quietly nearby while Olivia walked toward the small stage placed near the center of the hall, and although he expected her to simply say a few polite words, what followed surprised him in a way he did not immediately understand. Olivia spoke with calm confidence about how art had helped her navigate years of uncertainty while struggling to build a career in New York, explaining that creativity could become a powerful source of courage for young people who sometimes felt invisible in large cities. Her voice carried clearly through the room, not dramatic or rehearsed, but honest in a way that made several guests listen more closely than they had planned. Daniel watched from across the room while the crowd responded with warm applause, and he realized that the same authenticity he had recognized years earlier had not changed despite the comfort of her new life at the Whitmore estate. After the brief speech, several students approached Olivia to thank her, and she spoke with them patiently while describing the importance of staying curious and believing that their ideas mattered even when success felt far away. Daniel remained at a distance during those conversations, observing quietly while something unfamiliar settled into his thoughts. For a man who had built a career around numbers, contracts, and carefully calculated decisions, the sincerity he saw in Olivia's interactions felt disarmingly genuine. Later that evening, when the event began to wind down and guests slowly moved toward the exits, Daniel and Olivia stepped outside the museum together where the cool autumn air carried the distant sound of city traffic. For a moment, they stood side by side beneath the tall stone columns of the entrance while the glow of streetlights reflected off the pavement. Daniel finally spoke in a thoughtful tone and told Olivia that her speech had been remarkable because it reminded people why the event existed in the first place. Olivia smiled modestly and said she had simply shared what she believed, but Daniel continued to watch her with an expression that was slightly different from his usual composed demeanor. The ride back to the Whitmore estate was quiet, yet not uncomfortable, and as the car moved through the glowing streets of Manhattan, Daniel found himself thinking about something he had never considered during the early months of their agreement. The contract that defined their marriage had been designed to prevent emotional complications. But somewhere along the quiet path of the past 2 years, the woman sitting beside him had begun to occupy more of his thoughts than any contract had anticipated. And although Daniel Whitmore rarely allowed uncertainty into his carefully controlled life, that evening he realized that the rules they had followed since the beginning might not remain as simple as they once seemed. The weeks following the charity gala seemed ordinary on the surface, yet something inside the quiet structure of Daniel and Olivia's life had begun to shift in ways neither of them openly acknowledged. Autumn slowly gave way to the colder edge of early winter, and the Whitmore estate settled into long evenings filled with the soft glow of warm lights reflecting across the tall windows, while the wind moved gently through the trees surrounding the property. Olivia spent more time in her studio than ever before because the speech she had given at the Metropolitan Art Center unexpectedly attracted the attention of several small galleries, and within a few weeks she received invitations to display her work in 2 upcoming exhibitions in Brooklyn. The news filled her with quiet excitement, because for the first time her paintings were gaining recognition that had nothing to do with her connection to Daniel Whitmore. She wanted her work to stand on its own merit, something she had always feared might become impossible after marrying one of the most powerful businessmen in New York. Meanwhile, Daniel's days remained filled with meetings, development plans, and long negotiations that often stretched late into the evening. But despite the constant demands of his company, he found himself paying closer attention to the life unfolding within his own home. Sometimes he passed Olivia's studio and paused briefly when he heard music drifting through the door or the quiet scratch of charcoal against canvas. And although he rarely interrupted her work, he noticed how the room slowly transformed as new paintings leaned against the walls waiting to dry. One evening he arrived home earlier than usual and found Olivia standing near the large window of the studio, studying a nearly finished painting of the Hudson River during winter sunset. The colors were deeper and more confident than anything he had seen before, and when she noticed him watching, she smiled slightly and asked if the sky looked realistic. Daniel stepped closer to the canvas and studied the reflection of orange and purple light across the painted water before saying that it looked exactly like the view from the rooftop terrace of his office building during cold evenings in December. Olivia seemed pleased by the comment and explained that she had been experimenting with different techniques for capturing the quiet stillness of winter landscapes. Moments like that had become more common during the second year of their marriage. Simple conversations that carried an ease neither of them had expected when the contract was first signed. Yet outside the peaceful walls of the Whitmore estate, another narrative had quietly begun to form. Within the executive offices of Whitmore Holdings, Daniel's cousin Victor Whitmore had been watching the public image of Daniel's marriage with growing suspicion. Victor held the position of chief financial officer and had always believed that Daniel's leadership style relied too heavily on independence rather than family loyalty. When Daniel married Olivia without the approval of certain board members, Victor had accepted the explanation that it was simply a strategic decision. But as months passed, he began to question whether the arrangement was as straightforward as it appeared. Rumors occasionally surfaced among investors suggesting that Olivia had been struggling financially before meeting Daniel, and that the sudden rise of her art career might be linked to her connection with Whitmore Holdings. Victor never repeated these whispers openly, but he quietly collected information and watched the situation carefully. One afternoon during a routine meeting, he casually mentioned Olivia's recent gallery invitations in front of several board members and suggested that the company's reputation might be affected if people believed Daniel's personal relationships influenced cultural institutions. Daniel responded calmly, explaining that Olivia's work had gained attention because of her talent and that Whitmore Holdings had never invested in any of the galleries displaying her paintings. The conversation ended without confrontation. Yet the seed of doubt had been planted in a room filled with powerful investors who valued perception as much as reality. Daniel dismissed the moment at first because he trusted the stability of his professional reputation. But later that evening, while driving back to the estate, he found himself thinking about the delicate balance that had defined his marriage from the beginning. The contract had been designed to protect both of them from emotional complications and public scrutiny. Yet the world outside rarely respected boundaries written on paper. When he arrived home, he noticed the lights of Olivia's studio still glowing softly through the tall windows. And as he walked through the quiet house, he realized that protecting the calm life they had built might soon require more than simply following the rules they had agreed upon 3 years earlier. Somewhere beyond the peaceful gardens surrounding the Whitmore estate, the first signs of a larger conflict were beginning to take shape, and Daniel Whitmore understood that the stability he had carefully created might soon face a challenge. Neither he nor Olivia had anticipated. Winter settled fully over New York during the following weeks, bringing pale gray skies, sharp morning air, and a quiet stillness that often covered the gardens of the Whitmore estate like a thin blanket of frost. Inside the mansion, life continued with the calm routine Daniel and Olivia had slowly built during the past 2 years. Yet beneath that calm, a tension was beginning to form that neither of them could clearly see yet. Olivia's work had grown steadily stronger during the autumn months, and now 2 small galleries in Brooklyn had officially confirmed a joint winter exhibition featuring several of her paintings along with other emerging artists. The invitation felt like a genuine step forward in her career, something she had dreamed about long before she ever met Daniel Whitmore, and she spent long days in her studio preparing the final pieces for the show. Daniel noticed the growing intensity of her focus because even during late evenings when he returned from the city, the lights of the studio often remained on, and the faint smell of oil paint drifted into the hallway. Sometimes he paused outside the open door and watched her work quietly, brush moving across canvas while music played softly in the background. And although he rarely interrupted those moments, he felt an unexpected sense of pride that surprised him every time it appeared. However, the outside world was becoming less generous with its interpretations. Victor Whitmore had continued observing the situation carefully from inside the executive offices of Whitmore Holdings, and the news of Olivia's upcoming exhibition gave him the opportunity he had been quietly waiting for. During a small meeting with several investors, he casually suggested that certain galleries might be promoting Olivia's work not because of artistic merit, but because of the powerful name attached to her marriage. The comment was subtle and framed as a concern for the company's reputation rather than a direct accusation. Yet the idea spread quickly through the careful networks of financial conversation that surrounded Manhattan's business elite. Whispers began appearing in online culture columns suggesting that Olivia's sudden rise in the art world might be linked to hidden financial support from Whitmore Holdings. None of the rumors contained clear evidence. Yet the tone of the speculation carried enough doubt to create discomfort among the board members responsible for protecting the company's public image. Daniel first learned about these rumors late one afternoon when Claire quietly placed a printed article on his desk during a meeting. The headline was polite, but unmistakably skeptical, questioning whether Olivia Whitmore's gallery opportunities were connected to the influence of her husband's business empire. Daniel read the article carefully, without showing emotion. Yet inside he recognized the deliberate pattern forming behind the scenes. Victor had not made direct accusations, but he had successfully encouraged others to ask the right questions. Later that evening, Daniel returned to the estate carrying the weight of that knowledge with him. Outside, the sky had already darkened, and the winter wind moved softly through the bare branches of the trees surrounding the house. When he stepped inside, he noticed the familiar glow of light from Olivia's studio and the quiet sound of music drifting through the hallway. For a moment he stood there listening, aware that the peaceful world she had created inside that room might soon collide with the harsh reality of public opinion. Olivia looked up when he entered and greeted him with the relaxed smile that had become natural between them during the past 2 years. She showed him one of the final paintings prepared for the exhibition, a wide canvas capturing the stillness of the Hudson River beneath a pale winter sunset. The colors soft yet confident in a way that reflected her growing experience as an artist. Daniel studied the painting carefully and told her honestly that it was remarkable work, but his voice carried a seriousness that Olivia quickly noticed. She asked if something had happened at the office, and Daniel hesitated briefly before explaining that several media outlets had begun questioning whether her gallery invitations were connected to his company. Olivia listened quietly while the meaning of those words slowly settled into the room. She had always feared that her marriage to Daniel might create exactly this situation, where every achievement would be interpreted as a product of his influence rather than her effort. The thought hurt more than she expected because she had worked tirelessly to build her own identity as an artist long before their unusual marriage began. Daniel reassured her that Whitmore Holdings had never supported the galleries financially and that he would address the rumors if necessary. Yet Olivia understood that public perception often ignored facts in favor of convenient stories. The studio suddenly felt smaller and quieter as both of them considered the consequences of a world that rarely separated truth from speculation. Outside, the wind moved through the dark gardens, while the lights of the Whitmore estate continued glowing warmly against the winter night. But inside that peaceful house, the fragile balance they had maintained for 2 years was beginning to face its first real test. The rumors that had quietly appeared in online articles did not disappear as quickly as Daniel had hoped. And during the following days, the questions surrounding Olivia's upcoming exhibition continued to circulate through the same networks that often shaped public opinion in New York's art and business communities. Olivia tried to focus on her work inside the bright studio at the Whitmore estate, but the words from those articles lingered in her thoughts whenever she stepped away from her canvases. She had spent years building her artistic voice without recognition or privilege, and now that recognition had finally begun to arrive, it carried a shadow she had never wanted. Daniel understood the weight of that feeling, even though Olivia rarely spoke about it directly, and he found himself watching the situation carefully from both sides of his life. The business world that he knew well, and the quiet artistic world Olivia was trying to protect. One cold morning several days later, Claire entered Daniel's office with another update, explaining that Victor had arranged a board discussion regarding potential reputational risks connected to the company's public image. The meeting was scheduled for that afternoon, and although the topic sounded formal, Daniel recognized immediately that the real purpose would be to question Olivia's role in his life. The conference room inside Whitmore Holdings filled slowly with several senior board members who had guided the company for years, men and women whose decisions shaped projects across multiple states. Victor sat near the far end of the long table, with his usual composed expression, greeting Daniel with polite professionalism that revealed nothing about the quiet strategy unfolding behind his calm demeanor. When the meeting began, Victor presented a short report summarizing recent media coverage, carefully highlighting the articles that suggested Olivia's artistic success might be influenced by her marriage. He avoided direct accusations, but his tone carried a suggestion that public doubt could eventually affect investor confidence. Daniel listened without interrupting until Victor finished, and then he responded with the same calm authority that had built his reputation as one of the most disciplined leaders in the industry. He explained that Whitmore Holdings had never provided financial support to any gallery displaying Olivia's work, and that her exhibitions had been arranged entirely through independent curators. He also reminded the board that the company's success had always depended on long-term projects and transparent financial performance rather than speculation about personal relationships. The room remained quiet while several members considered his response. Yet Daniel understood that perception often moved more slowly than truth. When the meeting ended, he returned to his office and stood near the large window overlooking the winter skyline of Manhattan, thinking not about the company, but about Olivia. Later that evening, he arrived at the Whitmore estate earlier than usual and found her standing in the studio with several finished canvases carefully wrapped for transport to Brooklyn the following morning. She greeted him warmly, but he noticed the subtle tension in her posture as she worked, a quiet determination mixed with the uncertainty that those rumors had created. Daniel walked slowly through the room, studying the paintings that would soon be displayed in the gallery. Landscapes filled with color and depth that reflected the long months of effort Olivia had invested. Finally, he told her something he had been considering since the board meeting. That afternoon, he said that if the speculation surrounding the exhibition became too distracting, she did not need to continue with it, and that he would fully support whatever decision she believed was best for her work. Olivia turned toward him with a thoughtful expression and shook her head gently because she understood what stepping back would mean. She said that if she walked away now, the rumors would only grow stronger, and that the only way to answer doubt was to continue moving forward. Daniel studied her for a moment and realized how much her quiet determination reminded him of the same strength he had seen during that first charity event years earlier. He told her that he respected her decision and that he would do everything possible to ensure the situation remained fair. The conversation ended with a calm understanding between them. Yet as Daniel left the studio and walked down the hallway, he sensed that the simple arrangement they had built over the past 2 years was beginning to evolve into something far more complex than the contract they had once signed in a quiet conference room. The morning of Olivia's exhibition arrived with the quiet stillness of late winter, the kind of pale gray sky that often settled over Brooklyn in February, while the cold air carried the faint scent of snow that might or might not fall before evening. Olivia woke earlier than usual that day because despite her calm determination during the previous weeks, she could not ignore the quiet tension surrounding the event. The rumors circulating online had not disappeared, and several art bloggers had hinted that the exhibition would reveal whether her work truly deserved attention beyond the influence of her marriage. Yet when she stepped into the studio at the Whitmore estate that morning, the familiar sight of her paintings waiting carefully wrapped for transport steadied her thoughts. Each canvas represented months of work, quiet hours spent observing light across the Hudson River, evenings experimenting with color and shadow while the world outside remained silent. Daniel had already left for the city before sunrise because he needed to attend an early meeting with several investors. But he had paused briefly outside the studio door before leaving and reminded Olivia that the driver would be ready whenever she wanted to leave for Brooklyn. The simple gesture carried the same quiet respect he had shown her since the beginning of their unusual marriage. Several hours later, the black car moved slowly through the busy streets toward the small gallery located on a tree-lined block in Williamsburg where independent artists often displayed experimental work. Olivia watched the city pass by through the window and felt a mix of excitement and nervous anticipation because the exhibition represented something deeply personal to her, a chance to prove that her art could stand on its own without explanation or defense. When the car arrived, the gallery owner greeted her warmly and guided the delivery team inside, where the paintings were carefully unwrapped and arranged along the white walls under soft gallery lighting. The room itself was modest compared to the grand museums Daniel often visited for charity events, but the atmosphere carried an authentic energy that Olivia had always loved about Brooklyn's art community. During the afternoon, several other artists arrived to prepare their work as well, and conversations moved easily between discussions about technique, inspiration, and the challenges of building creative careers in a city that often demanded constant reinvention. Olivia appreciated the normalcy of those conversations because none of the other artists treated her differently once they began discussing their projects. However, outside the gallery, the world continued to watch with quiet curiosity. By early evening, a small crowd gathered for the official opening, including collectors, students, and a few journalists who had followed the rumors surrounding the exhibition. Daniel arrived shortly after the event began, stepping inside with his usual calm composure, yet clearly more attentive to the reactions unfolding around him. He did not attempt to dominate the room or draw attention to himself. Instead, he moved quietly through the gallery, observing how visitors responded to Olivia's paintings. Several guests paused for long moments in front of the large canvas depicting the Hudson River at sunset, the same painting Olivia had shown Daniel weeks earlier in the studio. The colors reflected softly across the water and created a sense of quiet distance that many viewers seemed to find unexpectedly moving. One art critic studying the painting began discussing its composition with a colleague, pointing out the balance between light and shadow that suggested a mature understanding of landscape technique. Olivia listened from across the room while trying not to appear overly focused on those reactions, yet the positive conversations gradually eased the tension she had carried throughout the day. Daniel noticed the shift as well and felt a quiet sense of relief as the evening continued without confrontation or skepticism. Eventually, one of the gallery curators approached Olivia and congratulated her on the strong response to her work, explaining that several visitors had already expressed interest in purchasing 2 of the smaller pieces. The news felt surreal after months of uncertainty, and Olivia allowed herself a small smile while thanking the curator. Daniel stood nearby watching the moment unfold and realized that the success of the exhibition had nothing to do with contracts, rumors, or corporate influence. It belonged entirely to Olivia and the dedication she had invested in her art. As the evening drew toward its end, the gallery lights reflected warmly against the glass windows, while the quiet winter night settled over the streets outside. And for the first time since the rumors began, Daniel understood that protecting Olivia's independence might require more than simply defending her reputation. It might require him to reconsider the boundaries they had carefully maintained for nearly 3 years. The night after Olivia's exhibition closed, the city felt unusually quiet as Daniel and Olivia returned to the Whitmore estate. The car moving slowly through the dim winter roads while the soft glow of Manhattan's skyline faded behind them. The evening had ended with far more success than either of them had predicted. Several paintings had been purchased. A respected art critic had written a thoughtful review praising Olivia's ability to capture light and atmosphere. And most importantly, the visitors who stood in front of her work had spoken about the paintings themselves rather than the name she carried through marriage. Yet despite the calm satisfaction of that achievement, Daniel remained unusually thoughtful during the ride home. Olivia noticed it when the car finally passed through the tall iron gates of the estate and rolled along the quiet driveway, where frost shimmered faintly across the gardens under the moonlight. The house stood peacefully ahead of them, warm lights glowing behind tall windows, the same calm sanctuary that had protected their unusual arrangement for nearly 3 years. When they stepped inside, the familiar silence of the mansion wrapped around them, and for a moment neither of them spoke, both aware that the evening had quietly changed something between them. Olivia placed her coat on the stand near the entrance and turned toward the hallway leading to the studio, intending to check the sketches she had left unfinished earlier that week. But Daniel's voice stopped her before she could reach the stairs. He spoke calmly, yet with a seriousness that made her pause immediately. He said that the exhibition had proven something important not only to the public, but also to him. Olivia looked at him with curiosity, because Daniel rarely spoke about emotions directly. And for a moment, the quiet hallway seemed to hold the weight of a conversation that had been waiting for a long time. Daniel walked slowly toward the office located near the main staircase and opened the door. The same room where he kept company documents and the safe that held several legal files, including the contract they had signed 3 years earlier. Olivia followed him inside with a mixture of confusion and quiet anticipation. As Daniel opened the safe and removed a thin leather folder, she recognized immediately. The sight of the contract reminded her how everything between them had begun, a careful agreement built on boundaries rather than feelings. Daniel placed the folder on the desk and looked at it for several seconds before speaking again. He explained that when he proposed the arrangement years earlier, he believed it would remain simple because he trusted rules more than uncertainty. He believed that if two people respected clear boundaries, they could live peacefully without expecting anything more. Olivia listened quietly, remembering the same conversation that had led her to sign the document in that rainy Manhattan conference room. Daniel continued by saying that the past 3 years had taught him something he had not expected to learn, that living beside someone with honesty and respect could slowly create a connection that no contract had the power to control. He admitted that watching Olivia build her career, defend her independence, and face public doubt without losing her integrity had changed the way he understood the purpose of their marriage. Olivia felt her heartbeat quicken slightly, because she realized that the conversation was moving towards something neither of them had ever discussed openly. Daniel finally opened the folder and removed the contract, the paper that had defined their relationship since the beginning, and placed it gently on the desk between them. His voice remained calm, but carried a quiet certainty when he said that the agreement had served its purpose, and that the 3 years were nearly finished anyway. He paused for a moment before adding that he no longer wanted their lives to be guided by rules written for convenience rather than truth. Olivia looked down at the document that had once represented security and independence, and now seemed strangely distant compared to the life they had quietly built together. Daniel picked up the paper slowly, and without drama folded it once before placing it back inside the empty folder. Then he said something that changed the meaning of everything that had come before. He told Olivia that he wanted to continue their marriage not because of the contract, but because he had finally realized that the woman standing in front of him was no longer simply part of an agreement. She was his partner in a way he had never allowed himself to imagine. The quiet office remained still as Olivia absorbed his words while the soft lights of the estate glowed through the windows, and in that moment the careful distance they had maintained for nearly 3 years quietly began to disappear. Olivia stood silently in the office for several moments after Daniel finished speaking, The quiet room illuminated only by the warm light from the desk lamp and the soft glow of the estate gardens visible through the tall windows. For nearly 3 years that office had symbolized the structure of their unusual life together. The place where business decisions were made and where the contract that defined their marriage had remained carefully locked away. Now the same room felt completely different, as if the quiet air itself had shifted in response to the words Daniel had finally allowed himself to say. Olivia slowly walked toward the desk and rested her fingertips on the leather folder that once held the document shaping their arrangement, remembering the afternoon when she had signed it, believing she was entering a simple agreement built on mutual independence. At that time, she had never imagined that the calm respect they practiced every day could gradually grow into something deeper. She looked up at Daniel and noticed that although his posture remained composed, the certainty in his expression carried none of the guarded distance he had maintained during the first years of their marriage. The quiet honesty in his voice when he spoke again made it clear that the decision he had just described was not a moment of impulse, but the result of months of reflection he had carefully kept to himself. He told her that watching her face every challenge surrounding the exhibition without compromising her integrity had shown him what true partnership looked like. He had originally believed that protecting her independence meant keeping emotional distance, yet he now understood that respect did not require separation. Olivia listened carefully while the meaning of those words slowly settled into her thoughts, and she realized that the life they had built together inside the Whitmore estate was no longer defined by the same boundaries they had once promised to maintain. She thought about the countless quiet mornings when they shared coffee at the long dining table, the evenings when Daniel paused at the door of her studio to study a painting before offering a thoughtful comment, and the night he stood quietly beside her at the gallery while visitors admired the work she had created. Through months of dedication, none of those moments had been written in any contract, yet they had gradually shaped the foundation of something far more genuine than either of them had anticipated. Olivia finally spoke with calm sincerity and admitted that when she first accepted the arrangement, she had only hoped for stability and the freedom to pursue her art without fear of financial uncertainty. She had never expected to find someone who respected her independence as deeply as Daniel did. The honesty in her voice carried the same quiet strength that had once caught his attention at that charity event years earlier, and Daniel felt a sense of clarity he had rarely experienced even in the most successful moments of his career. He stepped closer to her and explained that the contract no longer represented the truth of their lives, because what existed between them now had grown naturally through shared experience rather than obligation. Olivia looked toward the window where the moonlight reflected across the quiet gardens and realized that the future she had once imagined as temporary had quietly become permanent without either of them noticing the exact moment when it happened. After a few seconds, she turned back toward Daniel and gave him a gentle smile that carried both relief and quiet happiness. She said that if their marriage was going to continue, it should do so without any written rules limiting what they could become together. Daniel nodded in agreement and placed the leather folder back inside the safe, not as a symbol of control, but as a reminder of where their story had begun. The house remained peaceful around them, while the winter night settled softly over the estate. Yet something important had changed within those walls. For the first time since the day they signed the contract 3 years earlier, Daniel and Olivia were no longer living according to an agreement created for convenience, but according to a connection that had grown quietly, through respect, patience, and the courage to trust one another. And as they left the office together and walked down the hallway toward the living room where the lights glowed warmly against the dark windows, both of them understood that the life waiting ahead would no longer be defined by distance, but by the genuine partnership they had finally chosen for themselves.